My aunt sued me for a piece of inherited land. In court, she screamed, "That land is mine. You don't deserve it." I waited until her lawyer finished speaking and then quietly pulled out a secret letter. The judge read it aloud, and the entire room fell silent. I never thought I'd be in a courtroom, fighting my own aunt over land that was never hers to begin with. I never imagined she would go this far. But money and property change people. Or maybe they reveal who they really are. This all started after my grandfather, George Carter, passed away. He was a hardworking man, the kind who never took shortcuts, never owed anyone anything, and built everything he had with his own 2 hands. He bought a piece of land in Virginia decades ago, just a few acres, nothing extravagant, but it was beautiful, peaceful, the kind of place where you could stand in the middle of the field, close your eyes, and feel the weight of the world disappear. To him, that land wasn't just property. It was his legacy. And then he left it to me. At the will reading, the lawyer made it clear, my grandfather had made his decision with a sound mind. He wanted the land to stay in the family, but he didn't trust my Aunt Margaret with it. She had always been more concerned with what things were worth rather than what they meant. When the lawyer read that the land was left to me, she lost control. "That land should have been mine," she shouted, slamming her hand on the table. The lawyer remained calm, explaining that the will was legally binding and clear in its wording. But she wasn't listening. She stormed out, leaving the rest of the family in an uncomfortable silence. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A month later, I was served with legal papers. She was suing me for the land. Her claim? That I had somehow manipulated my grandfather into giving it to me. That he hadn't been in his right mind when he made the will. That I had taken advantage of an old man. I was shocked. Furious. Hurt. But mostly, I was disappointed. She knew the truth. She knew my grandfather wasn't confused or weak-minded. He had been sharp until the very end, making his own choices, handling his own affairs. And she knew he had made this decision for a reason. But that didn't matter to her. She wanted the land, and if she had to take me to court to get it, she would. I hired a lawyer immediately. My lawyer was straightforward with me. "She's going to make this ugly," he warned. The day of the trial arrived. I walked into the courtroom, my heart pounding, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. My lawyer had told me to stay calm, to let the facts speak for themselves, but it was hard when I was being dragged into this mess by my own family. Across the room, my Aunt Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table. She was dressed in dark, formal clothes, her expression stern and confident. She barely glanced at me. Her lawyer, a sharp-looking man with a stack of documents in front of him, nodded at her before standing up to begin his argument. From the moment he started speaking, I could tell what their strategy was. They were going to rewrite history. Mr. Carter was an elderly man, her lawyer said, his voice steady, practiced. And like many in his later years, he was vulnerable. My client, Margaret Howell, was his only daughter. She cared for him, looked after him, and was always by his side. And yet, somehow, the land that had been in their family for decades, land she was promised, was given to her nephew instead. He turned slightly, glancing at me as if I were a stranger who had stolen something. "We believe," he continued, "that Nathan Carter used his influence, his proximity, and perhaps even subtle pressure to convince his grandfather to change his will. This was not his land to take. It was meant for my client." I gritted my teeth, but I said nothing. I had expected this. But it was still infuriating to hear. Then my aunt took the stand. She put on a performance like I had never seen before. She sighed, shaking her head as if the weight of the world was on her shoulders. She talked about how much she had loved my grandfather, how she had cared for him when no one else did. "I visited him every day," she said, her voice cracking at just the right moments. "I made sure he had everything he needed. I was there for him. And then Nathan swoops in, and suddenly everything changes?" She turned, looking right at me. "He wasn't even around," she said, her voice rising. "He barely visited. And yet, he walks away with the one thing my father promised me. It was all a lie." She had barely spoken to my grandfather in years. She had only started visiting again when she realized he was getting older and that his will would eventually come into question. But the way she spoke, the way she wiped away a single tear, it was as if she had spent every waking moment at his side. I clenched my fists under the table. Let her talk. Let her dig her own hole. And then something happened that she didn't expect. Her own brother, my Uncle Henry, stood up. "I'd like to testify," he said. Margaret stiffened. Her lawyer quickly stood up. "Your Honor, we weren't made aware of this witness." The judge looked at my lawyer, who simply said, "He has relevant information regarding the case." The judge allowed it. And that's when everything started to unravel. Uncle Henry was my grandfather's youngest brother. He had always been close to him, and unlike my aunt, he had no interest in the land. And he had seen everything. "I won't take up much time," he said, adjusting his glasses. "But I'll tell you this. George Carter was not manipulated by anyone. He was sharp. He knew what he was doing. And he did not want Margaret to have that land." My aunt's face went pale. "Why not?" the judge asked. Uncle Henry sighed, looking directly at her. "Because she tried to sell it behind his back." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. My aunt shot up from her seat. "That's a lie." But Uncle Henry didn't even flinch. "I was there," he said. 10 years ago, she tried to convince George to sell the land to a developer. She didn't care about keeping it in the family. She wanted the money. And when he refused, she got angry. Stopped talking to him for years. And now, she wants to claim she was always by his side? That's nonsense. Her lawyer quickly tried to object, but it was too late. The truth was out. And I wasn't done yet. I reached into my folder, my hands steady, and pulled out the final piece of proof that would end this once and for all. A letter. My grandfather's last words on the matter. I stood up, took a deep breath, and handed it to the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I think this will make everything clear." The judge took the letter, unfolded it, and began to read aloud. And as he spoke, the entire courtroom held its breath. The judge adjusted his glasses and read the letter aloud. "To my grandson, Nathan, if you are reading this, it means Margaret is trying to take what does not belong to her. She has always wanted to sell this land. She has no love for it, only for the money it could bring her. That is why I have made my decision clear. If she challenges this, remind her of the deal she made years ago. She will know exactly what I mean." Grandpa George, the entire courtroom was silent. Then I saw it, the moment my aunt realized what was coming. Her expression shifted from outrage to something else. Panic. She knew exactly what the letter meant. But I was the only one who could explain it. I turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence," I said. "A signed agreement between my aunt and an out-of-state developer, one that she tried to keep hidden." I pulled out another document. My lawyer had gotten it just days before the trial, after digging through old records. I placed it on the table. The judge looked it over. Then, he raised an eyebrow and turned to my aunt. "Mrs. Howell," he said, "would you like to explain why you signed a contract to sell this land while your father was still alive?" My aunt's face went pale. Her lawyer quickly stood up. "Your Honor, this document is irrelevant. It was never finalized." The judge frowned. "That may be true, but it proves intent." I leaned forward. "My grandfather knew," I said. "He knew she had planned to sell it while pretending to care about it. That's why he left it to me. He didn't trust her." At this point, the courtroom was buzzing. Even the people sitting in the back, some family, some curious onlookers, were whispering among themselves. Then the judge asked the question that sealed everything. "Mrs. Howell, did you or did you not attempt to sell this land before your father passed away?" For the first time, my aunt hesitated. For the first time, she had no words. Because if she admitted the truth, she would destroy her entire case. If she lied, she risked perjury. And I could see it in her face, she was trapped. Then, just when I thought she would stay silent, she snapped. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, standing up so fast that her chair scraped against the floor. She pointed a trembling finger at me. "That land was supposed to be mine. He had no right to give it to you. None of you understand. I was his daughter." The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Howell, I suggest you sit down immediately," he warned. But she didn't. Instead, she turned to her lawyer. "Do something," she hissed. "Fix this." Her lawyer, now visibly uncomfortable, whispered something to her. I could guess what he was saying. There was nothing to fix. The truth was out. My aunt's entire case had just collapsed. And everyone knew it. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then my aunt tried one last move, one last desperate attempt to get something out of this. "I want a settlement," she said suddenly, turning back to the judge. "I may not win the land, but I deserve compensation. I was his daughter. I was supposed to inherit something." I almost laughed. After everything, she still wanted money. But before I could respond, the judge spoke first. "Mrs. Howell, your case was based on the claim that you were wrongfully denied this land. Given the evidence, it is clear that this claim has no merit. You do not have the right to demand a settlement." My aunt's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at me, then at her lawyer, then at the judge. And for the first time, she understood. She had lost. Completely. The land was mine. Just as the judge was about to make his final ruling, one of the court clerks entered the room, holding a folder. He walked quickly to the judge and handed it to him. "Apologies, Your Honor," he said. "We just received this document. It may be relevant." The judge opened the folder. Then his expression changed. He looked at me, then at my aunt, then back at me. "What is this?" I asked, my heart pounding. The judge took a deep breath. "It appears," he said slowly, "that your grandfather made another legal filing before he passed away. And it changes everything." The entire courtroom fell silent. The judge looked over the document again, his eyes scanning each line carefully. My aunt sat frozen, her hands gripping the table. Even her lawyer leaned in, clearly as surprised as the rest of us. I swallowed hard. What does it say?" The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading aloud. "To whom it may concern, if there is ever a dispute over my land after I am gone, let this document serve as my final word. Margaret Howell has no right to claim ownership of my land. She has already received her share of my estate. Many years ago, she came to me asking for an early inheritance. She wanted money, not land. And because she is my daughter, I gave her what she asked for. She received her inheritance in full. She is owed nothing more." George Carter, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She had already been paid. While the rest of us thought my grandfather had been holding on to everything, he had already given my aunt a large sum of money, her share of the inheritance. And now, after spending it all, she was back, trying to take the land too. My lawyer was the first to react. "Your Honor, this proves beyond a doubt that my client is the rightful owner. Mrs. Howell has already received what was due to her. Her case should be dismissed immediately." The judge nodded slowly, then turned to my aunt. "Mrs. Howell," he said, his voice steady, "do you have anything to say about this?" For a moment, she just sat there, staring down at the table. Then she shot up from her seat. "This isn't fair," she shouted. "That was years ago. That money is gone. It doesn't count." The judge gave her a long, hard look. "You took your inheritance and spent it," he said. "That was your choice. The land belongs to Nathan Carter. This case is dismissed." He banged his gavel, and just like that, it was over. I turned to look at my aunt. She was still standing, shaking her head, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to argue, but had nothing left to say. Her lawyer was already gathering his papers, avoiding her gaze. Then she turned to me. "You did this," she hissed. "You took everything from me." I stood up slowly, looking her right in the eye. "No," I said, my voice calm. "You did this to yourself." She had spent years trying to manipulate my grandfather, trying to take what she hadn't earned. And in the end, she had lost everything. She stormed out of the courtroom, her heels clicking loudly against the floor. No one followed her. Not her lawyer. Not her remaining family. She was completely alone. After the case, I went back to the land, my land. Standing there, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. I thought about my grandfather and the wisdom he had left behind. He had seen my aunt's greed years before anyone else did. He had known this fight would come. And he had protected me from it. Not long after, I received one final piece of news. Because my aunt had filed a false claim in court and wasted everyone's time, she was now responsible for all the legal fees. She had tried to take my land. Instead, she lost thousands of dollars in the process. That was the revenge my grandfather had planned without even knowing it. And it was perfect. Some people believe they are entitled to everything. They think they can lie, cheat, and manipulate their way into getting what they want. But in the end, the truth always wins. My aunt learned that lesson the hard way. And as I watched the sun set over my grandfather's land, I knew one thing for sure: this place would never belong to someone like her. It was home. And it was mine.